Hello and welcome to the Technology Risk and Gambling webinar series. I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm a professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and I'm director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic in the Brain and Mind Centre, which is supporting this webinar series. It is our fifth season. I can't believe it, but we have done a lot between 2024 and when we first started in 2020. So for anyone who has been listening and with us along this entire journey, we are so happy to have you back. And if this is your very first TRG, then welcome. My co-host, Khalil Philander, is taking a break this season, so it's just me, but we've got some fantastic guests, and I am incredibly excited for our first guest, which is Chris Raine. Chris is the founder of Hello Sunday Morning and Daybreak app, an amazing social program to assist people who are dealing with their alcohol-related issues, and the co-founder of Clean Slate Clinic. But Chris is also a Queensland Young Australian of the Year. He's made some amazing social change in Australia and internationally, and I'm really excited to chat to you, Chris. But before I get into it, I was curious about how you introduce yourself to people when you meet them for the first time.
Well, thanks, Sally, and shout out to Mark Scott for putting us in touch a couple of months back. So it's really great to get to know you and the work you're doing. It's very cool, and really happy to be on here. I find that question really hard, and in my kind of more difficult times, like say you're at a dinner party or meeting people, and they're like, "Oh, what do you do?" I wish I could say I was a lawyer or a doctor or like something that didn't require a bloody full hour of story to describe the complete soup of my career history. But I think probably the closest description would be mental health care entrepreneur. But even as I say that, I kind of cringe a little bit. But I think it's the best one that I can like that most aptly describes what I care about, which is building things that help bring great inner peace to people's minds, and working with clinicians and technologists or operations people to do innovation that is more affordable, more effective, and more scalable than that which exists already.
Well, I think that's a pretty great introduction, but you're right. I don't imagine there's many people who say, okay, and how's the weather after that
Yeah.
introduction? I want to get into all of that because entrepreneur and, inner health and social justice aren't things that typically go together. We typically see social public health campaigns, government funded mostly. So the entrepreneur piece is something I really want to spin on. But can you take me back just so people, listeners who are understanding how this all came about? You were in marketing, so more on the entrepreneurial side, but then what happened?
I fell off. I could have made a lot more money, and I got persuaded in another direction. I Yeah, so when I was 22, or even before that, through university, I was working as a nightclub promoter and put myself through university doing that. So my job was to sell alcohol. Typically, that's what the business model of nightclubs are built on. And So I was pretty good at that. And then that got me into advertising in Brisbane at this small agency there, and still, big part of the drinking culture in advertising. And then I decided, this kind of brief got put on my desk, which was to come up with a youth binge drinking campaign when Kevin Rudd was in government. The government they had like the Alco Pops tax, and all these agencies were getting things around like changing youth binge drinking, and everything the agency was coming up with was pretty terrible. And I was like, this would not change me or my friends. So I really wanted to understand my own relationship with alcohol within the broader cultural context of Australia's drinking culture. So I took a year off drinking from January 1, I think 2009 to January 1, 2010, and wrote a weekly blog about that experience. And the name of the blog, because it came out every Sunday morning, was called Hello Sunday Morning. And that took me on an experience of very much like personal change, like an experience was quite profound, but also a greater cultural conversation around how and why we use alcohol, like how to have a conversation that doesn't make people feel vilified for their choices, how to kind of wrap your hands around the whole thing and get involved in it, and one that I'm still really interested in. And then other people like, this is something that we want to do. So then they signed up and committed to not drinking for 3 months and 6 months. And then, I mean, this is 15 years ago. So over the next 15 years, this organization has, grown now hundreds of thousands of people are members on it. And I'm, as founder, just that role in the organization, but not on the board. I think that's still going and going really well. But also what's kind of been cool is the cultural shift, I think, in Australia that's happened over that time. It's not, you're either a full noise drinker or you're a problem drinker with, that deserves to be in AA. There's a whole gray area of, people being sober curious and changing and having different conversations and that being okay. And I think that's very much, I'm very proud of the work that Hello Sunday Morning's done to be part of that shift.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And I'll just say, if you're listening right now live, please pop any questions you have in the chat, because Chris and I are definitely going to keep chatting very readily. So if you have any questions, please put them in. And if they're interesting enough, we will try and get to them. So Chris, I think that's really interesting, and it's amazing the contribution that Hello Sunday Morning and you personally have made, because I agree, in Australia, there's been a really clear shift away from this idea of having to, just carry around a glass with a lime in it of soda water and pretend you're drinking a vodka soda. That now the non-alcoholic beverage sale is the rapidly growing vertical in the market. So it's a phenomenal change, and Hello Sunday Morning has definitely made a huge contribution of people feeling that they can actually voice this. And it's something that hasn't happened in the gambling field. And it's a similar sort of approach, that you're either, well, if you have to do something that's not gambling, well, that means you must have a problem with it. And that sort of a similar was in alcohol. And you've mentioned that, the Alky Pops tax, and there has been different things. What do you think has happened in the alcohol field to get to where we are now, where you can, I actually don't know, I've heard sober curious as a term. It's a great one. What's happened? What is the last 15 years? What have you seen as the small and kind of the big shifts?
Well, for me, and this might be a controversial view, it's highly debated, like around the relationship between mental health and addiction, or mental health and dependence on things. And like in my view as a non-clinician and a kind of non-polarized person, I think underneath is the drivers behind how we use these things to self-medicate or use or manage our emotions and moods and whatnot. And I think probably the major shift that's happened in Australia has been the change in and reduction in stigma around people talking about their mental health, and more open, more embracing of diverse ways of dealing with life and diverse ways of being, your identity in the world. And so I think that it feels on one level kind of safer to have that kind of conversation with people, and people maybe more curious about it, and for it to be more open, and perhaps also the increase in accessibility of social media means that, like, there's more examples of people being honest and articulating differences of opinion. Also comes at a cost, like, and there's problems with that as well in terms of moderation and harmful content too. So there's a lot of change happening, and I think it's sort of made the possibility of different ways of living better, but that also brings challenges too.
Do you think that there's some groups, do you think this differs across the population? That there are some groups that are more interested in being mindful of their kind of health or the impacts. I mean, alcohol it's quite a strong, clear health impact, because you actually feel different, feel poorly usually the next day. So it sort of does bring to mind those more health impacts. Are people thinking about the impacts of the people around them? I mean, well, what's behind the willingness, or is it a generational shift that these current, as you were a 22-year-old, do you think that older generations are having the same shift, or different groups? What do you think is happening across the population?
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess it doesn't quite answer your question, but just what, as you're saying that, I think about the conversations I have personally with people about drinking. And some of the best ones, I think, like where I do my best work is when I'm drinking as well and I'm explaining what I do. And like there's this conversation that happens around, well, why do I use alcohol as a drug in my life? And what are the edges of where it's useful and helpful? And I think that that is a conversation that we all have to have in the way we use drugs, or even things that have the propensity towards dependence, such as gambling, to understand those motivating reasons and the boundaries we set and sometimes don't meet and change and whatnot. I think that we're always trying to find that meaning and trying to find those lines and reasons, and that's what makes us human. And I think that what is just kind of cool is that I used to be afraid of those conversations. Like there used to be parts of me that would be like, oh, I can't talk about this or that in this context, because people will think that I'm judging them, or I'll feel judged. And I think that's changed quite a lot. I do think that those conversations are perhaps more open, but I mean, I have a particular perspective of being the founder of Hello Sunday Morning, that it's also like an identity versus an everyday person. So it's hard to know and kind of maybe ascribe that meaning to a broader demographic trend.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Is there a particular demographic you see amongst the users of Hello Sunday Morning?
So I mean, I sort of left as a CEO 5 years ago, so I'm not exactly sure what the demographics are now, but as I was leaving, I remember the average age was 39, 60% were female, female. I think 40% had kids, maybe, if I remember that one correctly. And most had kind of moderate to high like use of alcohol. Um, so the you know the 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 experience on there now, like if you sign up to Daybreak, when I first started, was like much more people, as like Asahi drinking hipsters, as someone once criticized me for, kind of here and then, but now it's sort of the shift, it kind of demographically kind of has come to people that have sort of formed decades long dependencies on drinking and are really looking to take an extended break or quit. So that's where I was now, but I'm not exactly sure what it is. What was then, but I'm not sure where it is now.
And that does sound like a different group. So people who are looking to quit, they've been using alcohol potentially harmfully for many, many years, and they're looking to really make a significant change, is a different group from those who are maybe more in that sober curious, where they're just kind of experimenting, thinking about it, trying something different. And I think that's really interesting. And if we bring it back to gambling, it's, we have had support for people who want to quit gambling. That's really been the most heavily emphasized area for when you've got a gambling problem, that, well, here's self-exclusion, here's treatment, you go in this bucket over here. But there hasn't been anything in the middle for people who want to gamble, but to make sure they're doing it we don't even have the terminology, in a safer way, in a healthier way, in a sustainable way. The responsible gambling, which is a terrible term, but for people who want to do it in a way that's not causing them harm, essentially, there haven't been a lot of tools. When you were thinking about moderating your use, and I know you were sort of stopped abstinence, but that's not what everyone wants to do. So if you're thinking about for gambling, or for people who want to be tinker with sobriety in different forms, what do you think, or what's been your experience of what would be helpful for people in terms of whether it's community support, social support, policies, industry change? What are the different levers that can encourage people to be more mindful about how they're engaging with the products?
Yeah. So, I mean, starting from a systematic level, I think, we ought to try and aspire to create a society where, mental illness and addictions and these conditions they're always going to exist. It's like cancer, like always going to be there, but they're well treated and they're brief, and there's very strong incentives to both, um, prevent them from those patterns staying for decades. Like and just accept that people are going to do these things. We're human, and there's utility to gambling and utility to using alcohol and drugs that is found in those things that that's why we use them, or why we do it. Like there's value there, but when that value changes, like to be able to quickly and effectively help people change that and navigate that better, I think so like from a policy perspective, there needs to be like strong um, disincentives for companies to get people addicted to their products and then keep them addicted to maintain that revenue generating force. And I would say that that needs to look like a variation in tax policy depending on the type of users and experiences of it. Also, I think anything that's addictive should, remove any possibility of advertising, should be available for people, but anything that encourages something that's already very encourageable, I don't think it benefits anyone. And these products should compete just on the value of the product, not anything to do with marketing. The things that we should market are programs such as you build it. Money should go into to convince people and make them want to make these changes because they're very hard. Like it's much easier for a person, like it feels good to use drugs and drink or to gamble, like, and there's value there, but it's like that it shouldn't be easy to do that. Like it should be much harder to do that as opposed to be hard to access things that mitigate that use, or treatment should be really attractive. In a kind of parallel world, maybe the things that are addictive should be non-profits, like and not be profit motivated, or all that profit go into like mitigating the harm effects and the things that normally the not-for-profit world that we exist in, or the for purpose world, is like that should be for profit and be kind of meeting the desire that people have in a way that might create a greater equilibrium where fewer people have these problems long term. So I think that like from a systematic level, like policy reforms can and need to happen, but they're really hard to do because there's lots of vested interest. I think that on a like an individual level or community level, in terms of the programs that we build, um, there's some there's a real human behavior around waking up with a hangover, or making a really bad bet, and there's a like a teachable moment that happens early on, that if there are lighter touch ways of en- engaging in a program, or things that help and engage the family as well, and are done virtually and at home, like it's not just integrated into a person's life, that a lighter touch, I think, and an incentive to do that. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, but it's a very hard space to work in because we have this kind of AA dynamic of like no problem, no problem, no problem, no problem. All right, I got a massive problem, in 10 years down the road, as opposed to, oh, that's a bit of a problem. Okay, that's all right, like, and sort of mitigating that crash landing, and um, but it is a difficult space, like, and I commend you for having the crack at trying to do something there.
Oh, trying to. And I think it's exactly like you say, that when someone knows they have a problem, they know they have a problem typically. The people who are coming for help, they didn't wake up and just realize on that one day that it's a problem for them. Typically they tried to stop it themselves and things cycled out of control, and they do know to some level whether or not, there are some levels of denial and other things going on, but there is a level to which someone is engaging in more harmful gambling, but the harms aren't being potentially realized, or it might be that they're not saving any money. So they don't, you don't, that doesn't feel the same way as not being able to pay the rent. Like you're neglecting your other relationships. But again, you're not realize the harms aren't sort of realized. I suppose similar to maybe some, alcohol, and you don't see the cirrhosis of your liver until down the track. But gambling does have that slower tendency to accumulate harms before things start getting serious enough that you notice in them there's already quite a lot of harm there, which makes it really hard when we're trying to communicate with people and say, gamble in a sustainable way, engage with these tools. People say, well, I don't need that tool, I'm fine. And to some point they are. They're not experiencing severe levels of harm. So, I mean, have you had any experience or thoughts on how to communicate with people who objectively they don't have problems? There may be some risks, there may be some vulnerabilities, they may be on a pathway, a trajectory, but how do you communicate with people and encourage them to change their behavior when they're not feeling like they need to change it?
Well, I think I would approach it like one way of thinking about it from like I think in the like the Hello Sunday Morning context, I think the thing that like resonated well with people, even just in the name and the branding of it was like, and Doc Stevens, he posted here about like, the losing a lot of money is equivalent to having a hangover. It's the light, maybe you make a poor bet, one poor bet among many, or whatever, and you're in that moment, or you wake up with a hangover and you're in that moment. There's some like the equivalent, I think, for Hello Sunday Morning would be, okay, spending that small amount of money on something, that's like meaningful or important or valuable that you now can't, or could be a possibility of making these choices to change. And I think that like it's a really hard thing to find incentives and motivations for people to want to do things that are moderate. I guess it's like the nature of being human is where like we're risk taking kind of creatures, and so I think framing those choices into something of a deeper value and importance and is like really, yeah, really powerful. Like I even think what do you think, Sally, about like the notion of status anxiety? Like I think for a lot of people that you know I've got plenty of things like alcohol and drugs and like plenty of things to keep my mind busy and trying to manage. But gambling has never been one of my things. So like I can apply what I learn over here to be empathized with this here. But from the conversations of experiences I've had with people around gambling, is like, is there a notion that like, okay, there's a material success that I get from being, successful here, and then like having more money and like kind of having a material impact? Like, how does the relationship between status anxiety and gambling interplay in your mind?
That's a good question. And people definitely gamble for different reasons, and the different forms of gambling do vary. So if you're thinking about in Australia, the biggest harms are related to pokies, and that's certainly where most, like, half to 2/3 of the money goes into poker machines. And that's, in clubs, even the venue's different. Is it a casino? Is it the club? Is it a hotel? They're different venues, but it's around kind of you're out, you're being social. You can be social without being social. So you're around other people and you're out of your house, but you don't actually have to talk to anyone. So that's quite good for people. You can kind of be doing something while not doing something. You're busy and occupied, but your mind doesn't actually have to concentrate on what you're doing. But you're also not thinking about your other things. So it's kind of a perfect activity for just being zoning out, chilling out in a way, which always seems a bit funny because it's so loud and noisy. But if you're kind of in it, that's just part of the atmosphere. So it can be a bit of a social thing, a bit of a fun thing, a bit of a zoning out thing. But compared to something like wagering, sports betting is increasingly now it's online. You're actually with your mates and you're sharing what bets you make. The products now are encouraging people to publicize the bets that you're making and to make similar bets to the other people or even to people you don't know. You kind of it has this social atmosphere of, and then when you're watching the game or the race, there's this yes, there's the personal excitement, but there's the people around you know what bet you made. So they're kind of cheering for you or commiserating with you. So it brings this level of socialization as well. So the different products are solving different needs. And then if you layer in that, that's kind of the engagement of it. But then the finances, and most people will say they don't gamble for the money. But at the end of the day, if there was no money there, people wouldn't gamble. So we know that there's a level of it, although people play games as well. So there's a level of it that the money certainly, it's about kind of the time on the device, or you get to, if you win some, you get to keep gambling more. So people might not gamble in the expectation of making money, but there's certainly something about winning and having a financial reward that is, if I have a big win, I can shout my mates all a drink. Or so there's different levels of success, and then across cultures we can, like, here's your PhD in gambling. Luck and status and face is hugely important. So if you're winning, if you're to be overly simplistic from an Asian culture and you're winning, that has high face value. That's something about you. You're luckier, you're more successful. So there's definitely an aspect of how you're perceived. Whereas if you say, oh, I'm going to step away now, I'm going to stop. And similar to kind of if you're all out drinking together, there is that like, well, we're doing it, why aren't you? Like there's that sense of keeping up with status and doing something that other people are doing with. And if you were doing something different, that is a bit alienating.
And how do you think about like this sort of notion, perhaps fallacy of the addictive personality? Do you think that there's I have a gambling account on my phone that I'll use like once a year, right? But and take it or leave it, like I'm with friends and similar kind of thing, or maybe I'll do that kind of thing. But then there's some things like, drinking, especially, like I have to be really mindful, like, okay, if I'm drinking today, then what's happening tomorrow? And like I can easily just like, just fall into those patterns of behavior. And people say, oh, I've got this addictive personality, but it doesn't manifest in these. It's not a generic thing. Or how do you see like things that become dependencies? And I guess just to, sort of that question comes from you're saying that I guess like do people go from gambling into gaming as a in the way that you might go from drinking into drinking non-alcoholic drinks sort of thing? Like is there that shift?
It's interesting, and there's not enough research. We know, for example, in COVID, when the venue shut down, that people did start doing more things online, but it wasn't just the gambling venue, like everything was shut down. So it makes sense that people were experimenting, looking for something to do. Like people were playing those like it was actually really nice. But you got on with your friends and your family, and you had all these family reunions. You're like, you haven't spoken to your family in 15 years. Now they're 5 kilometers away, so you're speaking to them every day. So anyway, like people were acting unusually, I guess we'll say, during COVID. So it's not a true reflection, but it didn't last. Like, yes, more people opened up sports betting accounts, but it's not like when the venues reopened, it was straight back in through the doors. I mean, the profits are up. I mean, let's not talk about money laundering here just to muddy the picture, but the profits were right back up and they have remained higher, and it's just an upward trajectory. So clearly it's not just a substitution effect that you can go from pokies, and even if you're playing online pokies or online wagering, it's not a substitution effect. We know that people do, I guess it's what's driving it, right? So if you're driven to gamble for some kind of distress tolerance, and that just underlying distress is never resolved, then yes, if you stop gambling, it's likely you're going to do something else. And whether that's, doing jigsaw puzzles because you've stumbled upon this as a distress tolerance, or more likely you're going to do something potentially harmful because you haven't had a skillful engagement with what you're going to do. But we don't typically see this sort of addictive personality when they have looked at people who are having disordered online gaming disorder and gambling disorder. They're actually distinct groups. We don't just see this global overlap that it just depends on what you pick. They do seem to be different types of people, often different family backgrounds, what you're exposed to. So if you never grew up being exposed to drinking, it would be unusual that you would decide to kind of wander off in that direction.
Yeah, and I guess the when I think about times where like I've taken a break from drinking, or encourage my friends are like, I need to stop drinking. I've always like know for myself, okay, I need to go and have a ritual of running and
Yeah.
gym and like do these things like, uh, you know, almost as a matter of life and death. Like it's like there's coping mechanisms to help order what is a pretty chaotic mind. What in for me, I know it's exercise, and as like a kind of thing to stop this sort of like spot cycle happening or anxiety, which alcohol helps deal with. What is it in gambling that people switch? Like that is, you've seen as an effective switch when they either pause or by doing so diversify what they get from the gambling.
Yeah, I think that's a really good. The thing I like about the running and the title of the blog, because you can't be fit and exercise with a hangover, or like at least it's a lot more difficult to do. So you're doing something that's not compatible with the behavior. So, you and it's also an excuse that you're pushing yourself, say, oh, well, I'm going to go for a run in the morning, so I have to stop drinking at this point in time, or like I can't stay out. So you're doing this antithesis of the behavior. And I think that's really sensible. We know for this from public health campaigns is you can't just say people don't do that. Like that just doesn't work. It doesn't work for dogs, doesn't work for kids, it certainly doesn't work for adults. You have to tell them what to do instead, drink one drink an hour, gamble, only an hour at a time, gamble less than, 1% of your income. Take breaks every 3 hours. The same for, safe driving. So we tell people what to do, but then, like you say, when the problems occur with gambling, it's not the gambling necessarily itself, it's all the other things that happen. So it's when you're not engaging in your recreational activity, you're not playing touch footy with your mates or visiting your gran, or what all the other things that you need to be doing to keep a healthy, balanced life. Because gambling in and of itself isn't problematic. Lots of people do it without experience harm. It's when you're doing it to the detriment of other things. So I guess it's like you're saying, it's building up whatever it is for you that's your healthy, it's getting your recreation in, your entertainment, you're looking after the various buckets of your life so nothing's disproportional.
I'm glad you finally said the 1% thing. I was like, so
Let's
if
go.
you're,
Let's, because we haven't spoken about now, but we haven't had any questions. So tell me about,
yeah.
as a social entrepreneur, you and I connected a few months ago and we had these long WhatsApp. I'd wake up to the morning and Chris has obviously had it. How
Don't
are we
make me
gonna?
sound like a creep.
No, 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 no. Like you've been thinking about this and I love
Yeah.
it because it's so out of the box. And this is what I want to do with this whole season. It's getting people who haven't been in the gambling field, how would you fix the problems? Let's see your solutions.
So it's one of the like unique things to the challenge of gambling. So yeah, so as Sally was saying, did a big sent me like six different kind of papers that sort of analyze the challenge of gambling socially and whatnot. So I'm kind of reading it and thinking about it as a complex problem. But one of the sort of simple ideas that kind of drew from it was that really the problem's relative to the individual. Like if you're gambling, um, it becomes it becomes a real issue if you're gambling a greater percentage of your income than you can afford. So and because when it becomes a real social problem is that your gambling leads to not being able to afford rent or not be able to afford a house or all these when you eat into the sort of foundational amount of money you need to that's at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy kind of thing. um so this idea is like, well, if people put a frame around or a bucket around the amount that they could gamble each year, like if they said, all right, and 1% seems like a healthy-ish amount of and it came like the 1% figure came out through some of the literature.
It
It
is
was like,
based on research. Yeah, we didn't just make it up. It does
yeah,
sound nice though, doesn't it? But it was based
yeah.
on research as well.
um, Well, I'm all about just things sounding nice.
I know really didn't want it to be 1.3%, did you?
no, you did, Sally. You sent me back 1.3%. I'm like, oh God. So if there was a way of,
We'll stick with the metric system.
yeah, if there was an incentive for people to go, all right, I'll only gamble 1% of my annual income this year, and for that to be tracked, like, so what's interesting about the work that you're doing is that now people get these account statements, activity statements from each of their gambling accounts. So you can see how much people bet. But if you married that up with how like their tax returns, and for there to be an incentive for people to do that, whether they get better rates on their mortgage or better like incentives like gym memberships or whatever it is that's going to be a driver for people to actually marry these two informations up, these two data up, then I think in if there's a benefit that people can still gamble, like you can still do it, but this is how much this is your budget for the year. That could increase if you win, but you can't go below that. I'm
I like it.
curious.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think, and then again, it's about repositioning and getting people normalized to these ideas. So similar to in the drinking field when they came out with the standard drinking guidelines. I mean,
Yeah.
don't know when they came out, but I imagine at the time people were thinking, I remember when I first, as a uni student, you hear binge drinking as if you have more than 5 drinks in any occasion. You're thinking, oh,
Yeah.
I've probably done that once or twice. So when you first introduce these guidelines, it can be a bit of a shock for some people. For others, it's not because they're already, well within that. But it's just about putting a peg in the ground somewhere. And I think that's what we need for gambling to say, like, this is what it is. If you choose to do more so, fine. But just be aware that this is what's healthy and you're up here. So like making people, and again, it's not about restricting people for me. It's about giving people the information to help them make their decisions. Yes, we can have nudges and defaults and strategies then down, as we get more complex, but providing people with the basic information so they can make an informed decision. I mean, there aren't that many industries these days where people are engaging in unsafe practices without knowing that that's an unsafe practice. But it feels like for gambling and this kind of spend thing, because it's so individual, that people can't even track for most forms of gambling how much they're spending. If you want to know how much you've spent on lottery tickets or scratchies or pokies, you've got no clue. You don't get a receipt. Imagine if you went to Coles and they're like, oh, here's your groceries. Well, we're not actually going to tell you how much that costs you, but you'll be fine. Here's some cash back just to muddy the water, and here's some promo bets, and every now and
And a
again we'll
free
give
drink.
you,
Yeah.
with a few things. So you spent this much, but it wasn't really that much because we gave you
Yeah.
some free stuff. That
Yeah.
just people wouldn't accept that.
Yeah. And I really like the 1% idea in just like even thinking about other challenges, like say take driving, for example. Like we all need to drive, we need to get from A to B. Like you're never going to prohibit driving. But and there's the road toll, but then behind that there's like speeding and like all these sort of things around it. Like um that I think if you put policies in action that were measured around what percentage of the population gambled more than 1% of their annual income as a driving force behind policy change, behind behavior change. Um, and if you build a narrative around it in the same way we have like a road toll that became familiar, that's like, actually, that's like, this is how we did this year. Oh, that's because of, COVID and whatever, like, and people kind of were doing that. Or this is what it was this year. And that's probably because, regulation loosened and this new form of gambling came out that this population of people were really targeted. And I think it's a good lead indicator to measure how we're gambling as a country in a healthy and unhealthy ways.
Oh, I like it. I think it's really important because it has been really chronically undermeasured what gambling harm is. Because if you
It's
just
very
measure
diffuse.
yeah, it's like, oh, what's the prevalence rate based on a prevalence survey? But this day and age, getting people to complete a 20-minute prevalence survey on the telephone it's not a great measure. And if you're looking at something that's, between 0.6 and 1%, do you get 30 people or 46 people to answer the phone is what, it's a really sort of not a great measure. And I remember thinking when they did alcohol related violence, that was a different measure. It wasn't just like alcohol harm generally. It was, and the same with speeding, it was or alcohol related deaths on the road. Like it's very specific. We don't have that for gambling. We don't have how many family breakdowns are gambling related, how many domestic violence incidents. We check that for alcohol. The police will check a box if there's alcohol involved in a domestic violence incident, but we're not checking that for gambling. And we've got community engagement workers, and one of them was telling me she used to work in one of the hospitals here in Sydney, and the worst night of the year for domestic violence. Any guesses?
Melbourne Cup.
Football finals.
Oh.
Football finals, worst night of the year. People lose. The winning teams go crazy. The losing teams, take it out on those around them. And it's awful. Like that's terrible. That's just absolutely abhorrent. And that's not documented anywhere.
What do you see as like I always think like what's the incentive for a person that might be where you are, like in the middle, on the path towards having a problem. Like, what are the incentives that would be attractive for them to do something different? How does that road fork?
That's a good question. We're doing a lot of work to try and figure that out, and it'll differ for different people. A lot of it will be something that has nothing to do with the gambling itself. That they'll be gambling, and then something else will happen in their life. When that's a positive event, like they retire and they've got a lot of free time, or a negative event like they lose their job or have something unforeseen happen, and so they're either their available time or their available money or their mood, something will change, and the gambling will sort of, they'll engage in gambling as a way to resolve that, or they'll just continue gambling even though they can't afford it. So that's typically what happens. Is it's not actually something about the gambling changes, but something in their own life that happens. I think what it is, it's almost what doesn't happen. What doesn't happen is people don't make a choice about gambling. They don't decide, I'm going to go and gamble $100. They just gamble, and then they go, oh, well, no, I've got to get another 200, or I lost money. And they kind of continue without a really meaningful internal dialogue and active decision. And that's what the gambling environment is set up. If you look about like pokies, there's no natural break in play. These days with race and sports betting, there's no breaking play because there's anything to bet on. Like it used to be, the race day ended at some point. They stopped running races, but now you just log on to the international market, or the dogs will start race. Like you can just continually bet. There's no natural breaking play, and people aren't encouraged to reflect, do you actually want to purchase this additional product? It's just kind of this continual roll.
So, as a thought experiment, suppose Tabcorp tapped you on the shoulder and were like, "Hey, like, we want to be a responsible company. Like, we're willing to sacrifice profits to do it. But in over a 5-year period, we want to be harm neutral as a gambling company." What would you? And you have to do it. You have to come and work for us as the CEO to do it. What would you do?
Well, I just got a new CEO, so good question. I
don't think that's her brief, or his brief, but yeah.
I'll borrow and steal from others. In Finland, they do measures of what proportion of their customers and how much proportion of revenue comes from problematic players. So they've got a baseline, and they can look at the metrics regularly of how much money they're making from people experiencing harm. So given those metrics, like you said, you've got to measure it till you know if anything's happening. Regular breaks in play. So the casino in Australia is just in Sydney and in Queensland. They're 3 hours now with a 15-minute break. Whether that's the right length or not, I'd probably look at some research to inform, and having sort of a mandatory shutdown or for each person, they have to take a break in play. And again, it's not about stopping people forever, but getting them to enabling that thought process. So,
Mm.
having them interact with the information about their own spend, sending them their activity statements with really clear summaries, looking at the cost and what the alternative cost is. So having things like pushing their money back to them as opposed to keeping it in an account, push it back in so they can spend it, but they have to actually put it back in their account if they want to spend it. So they have to make the conscious decision as opposed to it, oh, it's just in my wagering account, so that's just wagering money. Like, well, no, that's money. You can actually do anything you want with that just because it's in your account. You so
Mm.
pushing, so making it easier for people, taking the money out of their account regularly, making them think more, having more friction, stopping any of these continuous, like the Netflix style, oh, well, if you bet on this, you'll probably like to bet on X, Y, and Z, that kind of Amazon and Netflix continuous roll suggestions. So essentially what it is, it's not telling people what they can and can't do. It's not stopping people, but it's giving them the information they need, giving them the time and the space to enable them to make appropriate decisions.
Mm. And as CEO of this new company, what do you think? Like, do you think it'd be an advantage to implement these policies? Like, do you think the company would be like just couldn't compete and be driven into the ground, or what? What do you think the outcome of affecting these things would be for such a company?
To be honest, if you did it that way without hard limits, I'm not sure. It certainly wouldn't help the people who are experiencing severe gambling harm. So people would still
Mm.
continue to gamble. And at the end of the day, most people don't have harm. So if you're looking at like the bulk of customers, this shouldn't have a huge impact on them. I think what I'm trying to suggest is that you're stopping people from getting to that really risky font, or at least just slowing it down. And for the people who are experiencing harms, you probably do need to do some more strategies to help direct them into treatment. So you need to do also sort of the monitoring and identification. So you're alerting people as they're experiencing more risky behavior, you're sending them messages, eventually calling them. In terms of, I guess it's harder, and this is where it differs between the kind of the Scandinavian countries or countries where there's a monopoly provider, like for example, in Canada and in some of the Nordic countries, the government owns the operator and there's a monopoly. So it's a lot easier in those instances to put in stronger safeguards because there's less competition between providers. And that is
Do they
something
do
where
that? Like the problem gamblers, like do they? Does the government have that sophistication to go to call you up and say you can't gamble with in Finland anymore?
the government does it, but the operators in Australia, operators in many jurisdictions are monitoring. They have an algorithm that detects risk indicators. And when you get
Mm.
to a high enough trigger, they'll give you a phone call. It'll be they'll call it a welfare check. They'll check in, how are you doing? We've noticed risky play. Are you aware we have deposit limits?
How do people feel about that? Like, what normally what's the
The normal, from what I understand in speaking to different operators, the most common reaction is surprise.
yeah,
Why do you care? Aren't you trying to get me to bet more? Is this really you? Um,
interesting.
but
It's
people are
like
generally
disbelief.
positive. Disbelief, yeah, curiosity, disbelief. But generally, I'd say my experience talking to different operators is it's very rarely negative. People are generally either happy, supportive, thanks for checking in, really appreciate it, or nonplussed, but it's very rarely negative.
What kind of full circling back to the start of our conversation, and maybe you've covered this in the previous conversations on here, so apologies if you have to inform something new, but why do you care about gambling so much? What is the thing that keeps you so addicted to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, similar to you, I started out as a uni student doing psychology, working in bars,
Mm.
seeing people slogging out, for $14 an hour, watching people I remember someone got up to $800 in the pokies, and I'm there earning $14 an hour, and they walked away with nothing. And I was thinking, wow, that is like a crazy amount of money to lose in an hour. And the
Mm.
same, I was, doing the tab, and on a Tuesday night, two guys there was no one else in the bar, two guys sitting there, 50 after 50 after 50 on the dog racing, losing the entire night. I was just thinking, as someone studying psychology, this seems fairly irrational. And
Mm.
that was sort of what got me interested in this area of how can this be so clear from a negative expectancy? Like, these are commercial companies, surely people would expect they would make money. What is it that gets people coming back time and time again. And then learning, the more you learn about the ripple effect of the harms and the social injustice of it, and working individually as a clinical psychologist, I can work with individuals, and I have worked with individual people and family members whose lives have been devastated, and I can help that person, but I can't undo that harm. And that's what this is all about, is looking at how can I, as a researcher and, in the clinical work, try and make more systemic change, given that it is a regulated environment, given that it's commercial. How can we push as far as possible? And that doesn't mean pushing here straight away, but making incremental. With this in mind, we're recognizing that change does need to be incremental. And I think that's where it's interesting to speak with people like yourself around this. The social aspect of it is, how do you work with, the individual? I don't think it's fair to work with the individual. It shouldn't be their responsibility to have to kind of go against this whole regulatory and commercial environment. But we have to do this while we're trying to push for the government change. Like, how have you gone in your various roles of negotiating? How much do you enable the individual to have the tools to change themselves versus pushing for industry change or government change?
So I literally just so I've always been focused on individual and like the people around them, like, and sort of interventions that work at that level, um, for drinking. And then I went and worked in mental health policy. Um, and then I was like, okay, I want to apply policy to kind of mental health and alcohol and drug use. So I did a policy degree. And through that policy degree, I was like, I definitely don't want to work in policy. So I'm like back to, I think, probably my wheelhouse, which is building interventions that kind of, I think probably the area that I'm most kind of focused on is like working with clinicians, like people that have content expertise and technical people to build digital things that are sort of replace tertiary care, or like that kind of end of the line, something a bit earlier is the sort of sweet spot that I think I really care about. And I think that I think that's sort of where I can be most, I don't know, because my kind of skills really probably is doing that more than I thought. I probably, just not as smart as you, Sally, to think about like policy and how you affect it with this politician and that government. And like, I think I found that very hard and kind of mentally harmful for myself to try and do. Yeah.
No, I think that's a good approach in owning what your skill set is. I agree. I'm not, I don't consider myself an advocate. I contribute regularly to government conversations, but at the end of the day, you have to stay. If you try and do everything all at once, you'll end up being less effective. So I'm a researcher. Primarily, my role is to create evidence that can inform policymakers, and I'll try and disseminate and share that. But at some point, you have to hand that over to others to inform the policy change. Chris, we're at the point, I knew this would happen and we would get to an hour more quickly than we intended. I guess what I want to do is throw over to you for kind of a last thoughts of, do you think there's a role for social or entrepreneur or commercial, even if it's kind of a, what do you call it? Profit for purpose, that kind of different aspects now. So this is a stakeholder that hasn't traditionally been involved in the gambling space. Do you think there's a role for this organizations or people to, and what can be done to try and engender change from this aspect in the gambling field?
Yeah, I think um I think about the sort of path that some of my entrepreneurial friends from my MBA have gone down, and sort of worked in finance and airplane leasing and made a lot more money than working in trying to get people to do things they don't want to do. But I think it's definitely like hard, but of like a really fulfilling life. Like I think that you take a you take a current process that people go through that has a certain price attached to it or a certain investment of time, and then you apply an innovation to make it either quicker or more affordable or more accessible. And I think that's just the nature of innovation. So I definitely think there's um, opportunity for people to build companies that help different parts of the population better than what they currently are experiencing. Um, I think I also really like the 1% idea, and I think if that was a campaign that was built, there'd be there's some really cool things to do around that. That I think would be very difficult to do as well from like a financial perspective, but with the right kind of entrepreneur mindset could be done well. And you could build a community that would be very grateful and for that. So yeah, I think there's definitely opportunity.
Oh, well, look, we'll definitely stay in touch. And I regularly supervise MBA students on their capstone projects. So we'll keep thinking about how we can progress these ideas. But I want to say thank you so much, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you and learning from your experience. And thank you for sharing your personal stories as well. Although I think you've gotten me to share more personal stories than I have on this whole webinar series before. So good job. Season 5 is now totally off the rails. Um, and thank you to everyone watching live and everyone watching afterwards as well. Chris, your details are in the show notes so people can get in contact with you, maybe LinkedIn, something like that.
Great. Yeah, sounds
You're
good.
definitely Googleable, that's for sure. Uh, Next week, for everyone listening to the TRG series, I am going to be at the European Association for Gambling Studies conference, which I'm very excited about. So if you're going to be there, please come and say hi. But there will be a series dropping. So I'll be doing a pre-record, speaking with Simo Drostevchevich and Sarah Ramanaskis from Safer Gambling, talking about product risk. So that will be going live same time, same place next week. So huge thank you to everybody, particularly Chris, and a big thank you to Harrison Stein and TJ Santos from the Brain and Mind Center who bring us this series every week. And until next time,